Remembrance of Heofonbrycg. The vast ancient human construct of space station Heofonbrycg creaked and groaned as the Mechanicus exploiter ship Questor Revelation fired its maneuvering thrusters, drawing closer. Magos Ductora Cogitatis, Tiberius stood at the viewport watching the looming structure take form against the stars. "Moving into docking, Principes Magos," said Engine Seer Auspex Adept Carson Volks. Tiberius glanced over his shoulder at his second-in-command and sent a short data cant of appreciation for the other man's efficiency. They had been crammed together for 5 years in exile, his only true companion, aside from Voratrix. Another 15 years spent on and around the NihtWyrtha system, and to his own surprise, he had come to genuinely appreciate Volks's talents. The title Auspex Adept was largely honorific. Aboard an explorator ship, the job was inherently about seeking and collecting data, so the title essentially meant Officer of Looking. Tiberius had once thought it a pompous designation with no real merit. A year of war had taught him better. It was useful, vital even, to have someone aboard who could pick out an exposed exhaust port on an orc rock or distinguish a plasma mine from an iron asteroid. He turned his attention back to the station. From the outside, it looked far different than it had when he left. Additional struts, supports, and gantries had been added, forming new, more modern docking ports. The remaining spoke that once led to an outer ring now ended in a docking platform, dry dock facilities in various stages of construction. The macro batteries from the original Thermende Gaiet platform were being relocated into the relic's hull, replacing the shattered remnants of the original macro cannon. That ancient weapon had never stood a chance of being fired again. It would have disintegrated into rust dust the moment they tried. "There is considerable damage to the lower decks," Volks reported, his voice crisp. "From these readings, most of the station is voided or uninhabited. I am detecting atmospheric leakage on several levels. Should I inform Brother Nathaniel?" Tiberius shook his head. "Brother Nathaniel is more than capable of reading his own sensor data." "Of course," said Volks. "I meant no insult to an angel of the Emperor." Tiberius suppressed a chuckle. He had never known Nathaniel to take offense at anything. The station loomed closer. He studied its weathered superstructure. Heofonbrycg station had survived the war, mostly. After the first engagements, the Thermende Gaiet battery platform had been tethered to it to conserve power. 3 of Heofonbrycg's arc reactors had burned out under the strain of constant shielding and use of the relic Nova cannon. The reactors from Thermende Gaiet had been repurposed to power the combined battle station, a fusion of old and new, cobbled together out of desperation. In those early days, the station had served as a sanctuary for stragglers from the Grand Fleet, a sturdy bastion where ships from Incoloris and Manifold Dawn could dock under the protection of its shields. Sigibild and Edric had led the ad hoc crew, a patchwork of Mechanicus tech priests, scattered naval personnel from Manifold Dawn, and machinists from Incoloris. They had fought off wave after wave of orc assaults, barely holding the line, until Brother Nathaniel arrived. With him came 35 Wigathane warriors clad in cataphractii plate, forged in the Great Forge itself. After that, the fighting was one-sided. Brother Nathaniel had always been in the thick of it. Since the war, the station had been left largely untouched. It should have been a treasure trove of resources and archaeotech. But the demands of post-war reconstruction and the harsh realities of logistics meant it remained under Nathaniel's stewardship. He kept it running, barely, as a gunnery platform and auxiliary port. The upper levels had been cleared, but the rest remained sealed off, save for the shield and weapon systems, left to rot in silence, awaiting a suitable tech adept to begin the true research. 6 months ago, with the arrival of a peculiar old techno-archaeologist from Manifold Dawn, the investigation finally began in earnest. Nathaniel had taken command of the site, and Sigibild had returned to the academy. Now he came back to the station to see what had become of it with his own eyes. On the lower decks, standing by the docking port, Bjornwolf surveyed the damage. There had clearly been multiple boarding actions during the war. The telltale patterns of weapons fire that had punched outward through the hull were obvious signs of internal explosions. Orc weaponry, unmistakably. These weren't controlled burns. He noted it with a grunt. Serpenta weapons, by contrast, had been designed to burn hot enough to cut through armor, but not so hot that they could breach starship hulls. It had been a safety feature, used by Skitarii for millennia. That was why, when the Wigathane of NihtWyrtha traded javelins for long-range weapons, they had opted for Serpenta over las rifles. That, and because Paravox had offered an excellent deal on the plasma-based rifles. Hālgengas Voratrix had jumped at it. He could see the outlines of the crew in the many windows lit up across the station, shapes passing by, some stopping to look out at the massive Mechanicus ship as it approached. A few even waved, probably just glad to see other people again after being stranded on the farthest outpost from the homeworld. Most wore the war red of Mars. Some were Wigathene, clad in cataphracti plate. One figure stood out, tall, black-armored. He was pulling his cheeks wide with his fingers, sticking out his tongue, and jumping up and down in front of the window like a child. Bornwolf waved back with a pained expression. Clearly, Osric was aboard. Skitarii Alpha Braylon stood beside him, observing the strange display. She raised an augmetic hand and waved back. "He is very odd," she said. Bjornwolf nodded. Tiberius had once told him that the Iron Hands were known as dour and stoic men, hailing from the wasteland world of Medusa, harsh people from a harsh place, techno-barbarians, like the Wigathene in their own way. The Iron Hands had strong ties to the Mechanicus. Mentis, their chief librarian, had sent Chaplain Drenak and his squad to aid Archmagus Voratrix during her exile to the Arcana Inclusium. The Astartes wanted to establish a presence in the Reach, partly to monitor shipping lanes, and partly to serve as an early warning post for threats emerging from the Imperium's vulnerable eastern flank. But what had surprised Bjornwolf was how different the Iron Hands on NihtWyrtha seemed. Tiberius explained why. They were misfits. All of them had been sent here because they didn't quite fit the chapter anymore. Brother Castor, sorry Osric now, he was separated from his squad in battle, years before he came here. He was trapped in an automaton factory. He got the robots working and led them in defense of the facility. "That doesn't sound so bad," Braylon replied. Bjornwolf looked her over. Her augmetics were finely crafted, seamlessly integrated with her flesh. "You're Mechanicus," he said simply. Then added, "He was linked to them. When each automaton was destroyed, Tiberius thinks a part of Osric's mind went with it. He thinks Mentis sent him here to reconnect with humans." Braylon considered this a moment. "And the other Iron Hands posted here?" Bornwolf wondered if he should say more, but she seemed sensible enough. Brother Godric was part of a squad that was overrun by traitor forces. His captain refused to allow them to dig defenses before the battle. Afterward, Godric insisted on building elaborate fortifications everywhere he went. They had to cut through his barracks walls just to get him out. He kept reinforcing them. Braylon suppressed a laugh. Bornwolf didn't. He had seen combat shock before. They just sent him back to Medusa to pick up reinforcements. Tiberius suspects the cruiser will have an extra gun deck by the time it returns. Braylon nodded. "Not useless, though. And the apothecary?" Brother Nathaniel was the last Marine standing in a siege. As apothecary, he kept treating every wounded brother under his care, while fighting off orcs on his own. Rumor says he developed a nervous syndrome afterward. He won't reload a bolter with his left hand. That's the hand he used to treat the wounded. Braylon looked down at her own hand. She understood. "And the Skop Wolfgar?" Bornwolf paused. He thought of the chaplain. Drenak, now calling himself Wolfgar, was different. His Becher's gland was fully functional, unlike most Astartes, but Iron Hands were known to reject such features. To them, organic functions were signs of weakness. Flesh was a flaw to be purged. During a campaign against the Eldari, Drenak's company had been caught in a prolonged guerrilla war deep in jungle terrain, a place they hated to fight. Half their number were lost to attrition. The Xenos kept vanishing and striking from elsewhere, and they could never find the webway gates. In frustration, Drenak had bitten an Eldari seer. Through his Becher's gland and homophagia, he absorbed the memories, learned the gate's locations, and won the campaign. He saved an entire Imperial world, and for it the chapter cast him out. Bornwolf shook his head. "There's nothing wrong with the Skop. He was sent to keep an eye on the others." He lied. Drenak had done his duty. He had saved lives, and for that he'd been punished, for using the tools the Emperor gave him. Bornwolf understood. he would have done the same. Maybe that's why they were all changing their names, starting over. During the war, he had taken the name Wulfgar, not to endear himself to the locals, but to bolster their moral. To the people of NihtWyrtha, Wulfgar and Osric were their founder gods, the god of wisdom in Wulfgar and the god of strength in Osric. The people took to him as a leader, knowing he held NihtWyrd Hal in the occupied south of the island had given them reason to fight, superstition and oaths, a powerful tool of war. Beornwulf could respect the man for that. He scanned across the windows once more. Osric had wandered off. He saw him passing several viewing ports before finally stopping at one where Brother Nathaniel stood. More figures began to gather. Some waved, others simply looked out in silence. He spotted another shape moving past a window. This one wore black, not Mechanicus red or Wigathane blue. Odd. The figure didn't appear at the next window. But then, there she was again. He was certain it was a woman. She looked out at the ship. It must have been the distance. Or the lighting. But something was wrong with her face. Pale white, the texture like cracked parchment. A shiver ran down his spine. A metallic hand touched his shoulder. He jumped. Braylon laughed. The shift in gravity rippled through the deck as the two ships docked. "What's got you?" she asked, smiling. That smile, disarmingly human for someone more machine than not. Beornwulf grabbed at a stanchion, steadying himself. "I was expecting the gravity shift earlier." "Took me off balance," he lied. Again. He was making a habit of that. He cursed himself silently. "We'd better go aboard," he said, already walking forward. Apothecary Nathaniel placed down the auspex and looked over the assembled charts he had been working on. The steady buzz of servitors echoed through the room, mingled with the quiet murmurs of adepts and Navis Astra apothecaries working intently at their stations. The space had changed significantly since his arrival. It had once been a mere storage room for antiquated spacesuits, now packed up and sent to Mars for display in the Museum of Early Spaceflight. Nothing usable had survived the ages, but the suits still looked good when cleaned up and placed behind glass. They had appeared strange, with rounded helms tapering into beaked visors, not unlike some marks of Astartes' warplate, though lacking quilla or even the standard skull iconography on the pauldrons. They had cleared the space and filled it with research equipment brought in from Fiskbala Station. Toward the back of the room, a hooded tech priest stood overseeing an adept performing a chemical analysis on compounds found in the medical bay. Nathaniel frowned. The tech priest was robed in black. That wasn't Mechanicus standard. Perhaps they'd been part of one of the lower hall expeditions, covered in soot or oil. He shook his head. He was used to cleanliness, sterile environments, polished labs, orderly research. Around him, rust clung to walls. Grime seeped into crevices. The station had been abandoned for millennia. What did he expect? He looked again. The adept in black had vanished, probably off to clean themselves up. Good, he had no desire to give another dressing down today. A creak echoed from the steel hatch door, followed by the unmistakable weighty footfalls of an Astartes boot. He didn't turn. "Greetings, Brother Castor," he said flatly. "It's Osric now," came the reply. Nathaniel looked around and set the device aside. He hadn't seen the Tech Marines since the war. Half their squad had fallen during the Orc conflict, and the survivors had been scattered across the system. Castor, no, Brother Osric, as he now called himself, stood in the hatchway, holding what looked like a gleaming new axe. Osric had grown a beard, and his hair now reached his shoulders. His augmetic eye, once steel-plated with cog-etched chrome, had been replaced in Wirthan fashion, brass casing with a worm motif. "Greetings, then, Brother Osric," Nathaniel replied, voice dry. "Is this Brother Scop Wulfgar's idea?" The decision to found a new chapter had been made without consulting him. He had serious concerns about the compatibility of the NihtWyrthans with Astartes' implantation. A proper founding should require at least a century of gene study and testing from multiple Mechanicus Biologica sects. But Archmagos Demiavoratrix was ever pushing, like a warg with a bone, and she was pressuring Wulfgar to move quickly. It was wrong and against his instincts, but he could see her reasoning. The Reach was in need of an Astartes presence. The nearest would be the Space Wolves. But Fenris was beyond the squat holds, not exactly capable of a fast reaction in an emergency. Nathaniel rolled his eyes and turned toward the viewport, twisting the wrist ring brace on his augmetic hand. It was not the kind of thing an apothecary could approve of, and he suspected there was far more going on than anyone was saying. Osric shrugged, looking around, picking up an oddly shaped relic that resembled the breech of a bolter, or perhaps some other kind of weapon from humanity's dark age of technology. "So how is your research going?" he asked. Nathaniel took the object from him, a pre-imperial relic that in truth was just the nozzle of an ancient drinks dispenser. "Techno-archaeologist Vane Kelev is doing the research," he replied flatly. "I'm only here to ensure there's no threat," Osric snorted. "Vane Kelev? How did you get him?" he asked, surprised. Nathaniel squinted. "You know of him?" Osric nodded enthusiastically. "Among tech marines in the Mechanicus? Yes, he found the ossuary of Tumnal." Nathaniel frowned, twisting the ringlet on his augmetic wrist. "Just imagine I'm not a tech marine, not a priest of Mars." Osric grinned and took a seat, resting his axe on the desk, knocking over a collection of papers. Kelev uncovered a remote shrine world where tens of thousands of failed Mechanicus exiles were interred, an entire schismatic sect lost to time. He recorded and restored their memories via Vox skull transcriptions. From those, the Mechanicus gained access to a forgotten school of new spheric architecture, now used in developing shielded data caskets and secure cogitator cores. Nathaniel blinked, thought about that for a moment, and translated it into something functional. "You mean he found the code that blocks Vox thieves?" Osric shrugged. "Well, if you want it dumbed down that much." He was about to continue when the hatch behind them opened once more. Around the chamber, the Mechanicus adepts and Navis Astra staff immediately broke from their work. Some bowed, others knelt, and a few simply turned to face the entrance with various expressions of reverence and ritual respect. The buzz of servitors dulled to a low hum as even the machine minds recognized the presence of authority. Both Space Marines turned to see who had entered. Magos Tiberius ducked through the large hatchway, his trailing servo skulls gliding in behind him, scattering like silent birds down the lines of research tables. Beams of light spilled across parchment scrolls and dangling cables, weaving in and out of cogitator banks like electric vines. By the time he rose to his full height, his new spheric uplink had already updated him on every piece of research underway. "Greetings, sons of Ferris," he said. Bjornwolf and Braylon entered behind him. Bjornwolf had ordered Sinwolf to remain aboard the Quester Revelation with his warriors, and Braylon had instructed her Skitarii to stand down as well. They weren't expecting combat, and if it came, 2 Magi and 2 Astartes would suffice. More armed men would only clutter the field. The Mechanicus adepts remained bowed or saluting. Nathaniel gave a respectful nod, while the newly redesignated Osric offered an offhand wave. Tiberius stood motionless, but his servo skulls dispersed to different exits, each taking a designated monitoring route. "So, Apothecary," he said, "I see you've concluded there is no infection aboard the station." Nathaniel tapped the nearest cogitator bank. "Not in the biological sense," he agreed. "No trace of pathogen. I've completed analysis of the remains of the crew, what little was left of them. Mostly bones, nothing infectious, save for a few cases showing signs of early-stage rust fever." Tiberius tilted his head slightly. "Adept Heathred filed a report stating he discovered a neuroinhibitor node, yet there's no mention in your documentation." Nathaniel reached for a data slate. A servo skull hovered near, scanning the data contained within. "I deal with biologicals," he said simply. "But yes, we found at least 30 bodies with neuroinhibitor implants." Osric placed a hand on the apothecary's pauldron. "If I may, Magos Tiberius, when Adept Hathred departed the station, I personally examined the unit he recovered. It was configured to suppress melatonin and block REM sleep." Nathaniel nodded, continuing. "Analysis of the tissue remains showed elevated levels of chemical inhibitors, all oriented toward keeping the crew awake or suppressing dreaming during rest states." As they spoke, Bjornwolf stood before an ancient, rusted section of wall. A newly installed Mechanicus lumen rod buzzed overhead, casting harsh light across the oxidized metal. Beneath it, stenciled in peeling red paint, written in Old Wirthan, were the words, "Neslop." Exactly as Tiberius had told him, he grimaced. They really took their work ethic to a new level, he muttered. Braylon stood beside him, reading the same word. An order, not a suggestion. A command. Do not sleep. She looked from the painted word to Nathaniel, then to Bornwolf. What do you think they were afraid of, in their sleep? Bornwolf reached for the ring hanging from his gorget, letting it rest in his hand. Maybe there was something that only struck when people did sleep. Not an infection, Nathaniel interjected, having overheard. He paused. Something else. Tiberius turned toward Bornwolf. He has a point. I thought the same back when I first came here. Nathaniel affixed his helm with a hiss and maglocked it to his armor. He turned and gestured toward a dim corridor. The techno-archaeologist will explain. Tiberius motioned for them to move out, casting a last glance toward Bjornwolf. This is a puzzle I would truly like an answer to. Bjornwolf nodded and followed in his wake. Vane Kelev adjusted the lumen settings on his accompanying servitor. It had been dimming slightly, and the inconsistency had been irritating him. The old techno-archaeologist then shuffled toward the hatch and motioned for the machinist adept to begin cranking the handle-shaped lever to open it. Behind him, Tiberius entered, with Bjornwolf and Braylon following, and Nathaniel and Osric bringing up the rear. Kelev turned to greet them. Ah, perfect. We're just about to reopen the newly sealed section. Your timing is a perfect coincidence. Not at all, said Tiberius. Brother Nathaniel told me in advance you would be breaking the seal. I made haste to come. He gestured to the room around him. The walls were rust-streaked, the paint long gone. Stagnant pools of green water sat in depressions, and the chamber smelled like one of NihtWyrtha's sunken cities. This was my find, after all, the old man chuckled. Yes, well, you wouldn't have gotten this far anyway. This level and the three above were completely flooded. The chambers beyond were open to the void. Adept Hathra had only just completed patching the outer hull before he left. Nathaniel nudged aside a bundle of rotted kelp from the pathway with a look of revulsion. Yes, Lieutenant Sigabild thought the orcs had attempted to dock in this section, but his men couldn't come down to confirm. Turned out they had, 3 breaching pods and a heavy transport. We found them all flooded, 80 orc bodies. He laughed uncharacteristically. The Mechanicus drew lots to see who had to dive and collect the bodies. Took a week to clear. Bjornwolf looked amazed. How big is this station, and how much water? Oh, my dear fellow, said Kelev, rubbing his hands. The station is 5 miles high, though a mile of that is antennae and assorted protrusions. The circumference is 3 miles, considerable volume. Of course, there's an atrium in the central core. It once had trees, you know. He beckoned them to follow him into an alcove. There was also a sea, a proper one, an entire lower deck of ocean. It seems that's where the water came from. We found bones of various fish, even aquatic mammals. Bjornwolf made a face. My people seem to have had a fondness for oceans, he said dryly. He didn't like the idea that he was standing in what had once been a sea. He wondered briefly, where did they even pump all the water to? Kelev moved aside a servitor that had been gently polishing a display case. Behold, Heofonbrycg station as it once looked, he said proudly. Inside the case sat a preserved scale model, encased for millennia in water, yet perfectly intact. It was the station they now stood in, but around it were 7 massive rings, each of differing size. From the way they were mounted, it looked like they were meant to move independently. Tiberius, who had long suspected such a structure, was visibly impressed. Pre-Dark Age humanity appears to have had very few limits in engineering, Osric frowned. Why so many rings? The techno-archaeologist chuckled. Oh, I doubt all 7 were inhabited. From what I've uncovered in accessible schematics and physical layout, each ring housed a modular habitat. My working hypothesis is that this station, or its components, was launched ahead of the original colonists. Constructed by automata, I believe each ring hosted its own biome to grow flora and fauna for future terraforming operations. A servo skull hovered beside him holding up his notes. Kelev continued. The golden crown on Manifold Dawn was probably the base of an identical structure. Bornwolf looked startled. You mean, the colonists of Manifold Dawn are related to those of NihtWyrtha? Oh no, Kelev said, waving dismissively. Records from Manifold Dawn indicate the 5 towers were rediscovered by the Pre-Imperium shortly before the cybernetic revolt. All scripture indicates the system was devoid of human life at the time. He chuckled again. There's an old tale of an explorer named Von Deelen, who found the Dawn Tower and adventured with a... He trailed off, caught in a bout of old man nostalgia and half-remembered legends. Meanwhile, Braylon's optics caught a figure passing near the rear doors. Mechanicus robes, but soaked, drenched. The color was wrong too, black, not red. Perhaps a cleaner? Someone covered in oil? She excused herself silently, slipping away from the group. Despite all her augmetics, she was still human. And that instinct, the old one, the one older than circuitry, was prickling at her spine. She entered the next room. Empty. No sound, no footprints, nothing. The direction the figure had come from led straight into a solid sealed bulkhead wall. On it, hidden beneath grime, were faded red letters, Neslip. The room had once been some form of observation deck. Beyond the blast-scarred windows she saw the pale orange sphere of Therminde Geat, hanging in the void like a lidless eye. From the far side of the room, her augmented ears picked up a sound, a clink, the sliding of chain, a sound she hadn't heard since the docks of her homeworld. She jumped as a hand landed on her shoulder. It was Brother Nathaniel. He smiled gently. I've heard this story 3 times already. He's nearly at the end. She smiled back, and the two of them walked together back into the kelp-strewn chamber. And that, Kelev said with a laugh, and that is how they first made planetfall. You can imagine, they had to wait a full day before the ropes came back into reach. He grinned, shaking his head. Can you imagine? That huge structure rolling along the surface of the planet for millennia before humanity rediscovered it again. Of course, there were 5 golden towers back then. Now there are only 4. The ancient humans, they were clearly not held back by scale back then. Osric was frowning. So what happened to the elephant? Brother Nathaniel raised a placating hand. Magos Kelev, Magos Tiberius was wondering about your hypothesis, what you believe really happened to this station. Tiberius, who had been momentarily lost in the old man's storytelling, blinked and remembered his purpose. Yes, exactly, as the brother apothecary said. He told me about the crew using stimulants and inhibitors in their final days, the implants to block REM sleep and subconscious dreaming. He said there was no biological reason, but that you had your own ideas. Ah, my dear fellow, said Kelev with a twinkle in his voice. That is why I am down here. He turned to the servitor still gripping the manual crank handle. My research has brought me to believe that what we seek, the answer, lies behind this door. Tiberius's mechadendrites twitched. Couldn't you just tell us now? Save everyone the wait? Oh, no, that wouldn't do at all, Kelev said, shaking his head. Servitor, kindly begin. With a hiss of servos, the servitor began to crank. Slowly, the heavy blast door unlocked at its base. A reek spilled out, a foul combination of damp sulfur and overripe perfume made from decayed, aromatic flowers. Tiberius winced. Ah, I didn't expect the smell, Kelev admitted. This section was voided early in the station's life. In fact, it's likely been in vacuum ever since the disaster that dropped us into the gas giant's outer atmosphere. The crank turned. Inch by inch, the heavy hatch lifted. The techno-archaeologist's voice echoed through the sound of the crank. As you know, the macro cannon decks were cleared first. Not one of the devices functioned, or could even be fully understood. The 2 most intact examples were requested by Mars, so we packed them up and sent them off. Then came the 6 Nova Cannon variants. We've decided to designate them Sigabild pattern Nova Cannons. How apt, said Tiberius dryly. They appear to be early and much larger versions of the kind once used on great walking engines during the Dark Age. Modern Nova designs, derivative by comparison, he chuckled. We still have the functional one, of course, the one mounted here. Its firing time's been reduced to just 3 minutes, by the way. He laughed again, as if sharing an inside joke with the station itself. Kelev kept talking. The other Nova cannon blew up, as you know, but after the war, we discovered only the reaction chamber was damaged. Archmagos Voratrix requested the barrel herself. Of the 4 remaining relic cannon, we recovered enough components to reassemble a second weapon. Tiberius grunted. Yes, I know. Voratrix still hopes to mount it on Fiskbala Station, if the adepts can ever figure out how to put it together. He didn't sound convinced. The systems were beyond what most Mechanicus personnel could comprehend. The smell was getting worse as the door edged upwards with each turn of the handle. Beornwulf frowned at the stench but calmly drew his Sepenta, thumb resting on the safety. This section may have been dead for millennia, but he'd heard Osric's stories. Braylon laid a hand on her pistol grip but did not draw it. She felt a whisper of air behind her. Turning her head slightly, her augmetic eye caught a glimpse, a figure in black. Gone in an instant. Just shadows, she told herself. Tiberius tapped his foot. Isn't there a functioning mechanism? An automatic system? There was, Kilev replied, holding up a fused bundle of wires, corroded into a solid mass of twisted plastic and metal. As he raised it, the whole thing crumbled into dust and drifted to the floor. Unfortunately, a combination of exposure to gas giant pressures and prolonged submersion have rendered this section somewhat manual. We're back to door handles, I'm afraid. The door finally reached its lock point with a heavy clang. The servitor stepped back. Tiberius made to move forward, but Beornwulf raised a blocking hand. Security forward, Magos Tiberius, he said firmly. With a glance to Osric, who responded by raising his axe, and a nod to Braylon, Beornwulf stepped through the threshold first. Osric flanked him, weapon ready. Braylon moved ahead of Tiberius, body poised, scanning for threats. She stood tall between her commander and the unknown. Beyond the door, blackness loomed. Water dripped from the ceiling, condensation from the newly reoxygenated section. Servo skulls and servitors moved quietly behind the party, darting between alcoves as lumens flickered across walls and furniture. Track-mounted servitors uncoupled power and cogitator cables as they advanced, laying down light and order as they crept deeper into darkness. Osric's armor-mounted lumens and Beornwulf's weapon lumen lit the way ahead. Pools of stagnant water splashed beneath their boots. Broken tiles, warped panels, and old debris littered the corridor. They passed a yellowed, curling picture on the wall, a schematic of Heofonbrycg Station, unmistakable with its 7 concentric rings. Sulfur stains streaked the surface, and more of the yellow dust clung to the serpentine wall carvings, half lost to corrosion. Beornwulf turned a corner and paused. Other than Kelev's voice and the dripping of water, there was an eerie silence he did not like. Ahead lay a long corridor, flanked by what looked like refrigeration units, ancient and warped. The walls around them were coated in yellowed rust blooms, streaked with crystalline growths formed from the chemical residues of boiled-away contaminants. Stalactites hung from the unit frames. The whole place felt off, as though space itself had warped slightly under the pressure of the gas giant and centuries of degradation. Bulkheads bowed, pressure doors bulged outward, a thin sheen of oily frost clung to the floor like a disease. Osric came up beside him and gave a short nod to continue. Their lumens swept forward in flickering waves. Beornwulf raised a hand, something ahead. He took aim silently. Osric drew his bolt pistol, and Nathaniel shifted forward to cover Braylon's position as she darted ahead, sweeping her augmetic optics left and right. Beornwulf approached slowly. The body lay against the wall, half covered in debris. It wore some kind of fiber uniform, now browned and faded. Yellow sulfur stains streaked the cloth. Time and atmosphere had bleached it into a shadow of what it once was. He knelt, brushing aside a fraying scrap of cloth. Hollow eyes stared back. Skin like dried parchment, lips curled. A mummified corpse, preserved by millennia of vacuum and the caustic touch of Thermendegat's upper winds. Long hair, bleached and fanned out, speckled with sulfur crystals. On NihtWyrtha, both men and women wore their hair long, but tied into this one's hair was a silver charm, a half moon. Beornwulf froze. On his homeworld, such a charm was only worn by women. Had it always been that way? Was this where the custom came from? Had this woman, this dead figure, once walked beneath NihtWyrtha's skies before the Geofon flooded the land? He didn't know. But the body before him had been human, one of his people, before history became myth. Moving the lumen over the corpse, Beornwulf noticed the body was lying with one arm beneath it. Something caught the light, crystal, poking out from beneath the ragged clothing. He knelt, carefully brushing at it. At first he thought it was a jewel, some adornment, but as he pulled, he realized whatever it was being held, clutched in the dead woman's hand. Osric noticed too. He looked at Beornwulf, then stepped forward. With a muttered apology to the fallen, he heaved the body upward. It moved in one solid piece, desiccated and rigid like plaster. Bjornwolf reached in and tugged. There was a dry snap as brittle fingers gave way. He rose, the light of the servo-skulls casting eerie shadows across his face. In his grip was a pistol, not like any he had ever held. It was crystal, its frame encasing a semi-organic core. He couldn't tell what it was, some kind of reactive latticework, or something alive once. The grip was made of Wirthan brass, and etched upon it were two entwined serpents, symbolizing the eternal balance of life and death. It bore the mark of Wulfgar himself. "Looks Xenos," said Osric, and spat over his shoulder to ward off spirits, a Wirthan custom he'd picked up to go with his new beard. Bjornwolf shook his head. "The handle is Wirthan." He drew his seeks and showed the hilt. "Same brass, same serpent motif." "Besides," he said, "I know what it is." Braylon stepped forward. "That's Sildathnidal," she breathed, "the whisper needle of legend." Kilev shuffled up beside her, eyes wide. "In the name of he who sits on the throne," he whispered, voice shaking. "A neurodisruptor." Nathaniel and Tiberius both moved forward quickly. Nathaniel snarled, "Xenos filth wielded by a human? Heresy!" He reached for the pistol, but one of Tiberius's mechadendrites snatched it from Bjornwolf's hand before he could grab it. Now, son of Ferris, calm yourself," said Tiberius smoothly. He turned the weapon over in his mechanical grip, his augmented eye focusing. "There are no Xenos here." He examined it. Most interesting." He turned it again, noting the emblem. "And Wulfgar's stamp as well." Nathaniel's face tightened in disbelief. "You mean Chaplain Drenak is involved in this?" Tiberius looked at him hard. "Have you suffered a cranial impact recently, brother apothecary? Or perhaps some radiation exposure?" He leaned in, his mechanical legs hissing, lifting him taller than even the Astartes. "Wulfgar is a figure from NihtWyrtha myth. That's who Drenak took his name from." He flourished the pistol, still keeping it just out of reach. "And apparently, he was not a myth. This was his weapon, not Xenos, Dark Age human." Osric crossed his arms, frowning. "I'm named after Osric from the same myth, so if you go after the chaplain, I'd be oath-sworn to avenge him." He looked to Bjornwolf. "That's right, isn't it?" Bjornwolf shrugged. "Well, Osric was the runesmith of the gods. Wulfgar was the seer who inscribed the words of power on his weapons. It's always been debated which outranks the other." He scratched his chin. "So, if Drenak is your master, then yes, you'd be oath-sworn to avenge him, unless it was a fair challenge, in which case if Brother Nathaniel won it would be honorable and you couldn't do a thing." Osric raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Lucky this time, peasant." Nathaniel straightened, twisting the ring on his augmetic wrist. "My apologies, Lord Tiberius." Tiberius nodded. "No oil spilt between friends." Bjornwolf watched Tiberius handle the weapon. "There's no trigger. Would it be designed for use in a void suit, with the activation linked to the mind via hardwire?" Tiberius looked at the Wigathane with a glint of surprise. He hadn't expected such insight from one outside the Mechanicus. "An excellent observation, and a fine understanding of mechanistic function, especially for one not sworn to Mars. But no, not in this case." He scanned the crystalline structure with his inbuilt auspex. The core is a psi-reactive crystal array, similar to those used by the Eldari. The weapon is activated by thought. Bjornwolf furrowed his brow. "So, it's magic?" Tiberius chuckled, relieved that the warrior's knowledge didn't extend too far. "It's a psionic weapon, activated by will, guided by the mind." Nathaniel, standing nearby with arms folded, grunted, quite out of character. "Sounds Xenos." Osric clapped a hand on the apothecary's pauldron. "I'll be sure to tell Mentor Psychonomentis that his power stave is Xenos. He'll be so happy." "Quite," said the techno-archaeologist, taking the weapon from Tiberius and turning it over in his hands. "The Imperium uses many psychic weapons. Perhaps this is the forerunner of them all." Nathaniel, still refusing to yield, raised a finger. "But the Psyker gene only emerged during the Age of Strife, 10,000 years ago. These bodies are nearly 20,000 years old. The dates don't match." Tiberius shook his head. "Widespread Psyker emergence happened during the Age of Strife. Yes, but at least the Navigator gene existed in the Dark Age of technology. That would date this weapon right to the earliest days of psionic utility." "Not impossible," Braylon interjected. "In the old Wirthan legends, Osric visited the celestial homeworld, the place of the gods. He went to ask for a weapon to settle a dispute. The Hlaford Heofonbrycg gave him metal ore and sent him to the moon of Anaris Elthir, where the Skyforge lay. He returned with Sildathnidal and used it to settle the matter. Nathaniel and Osric exchanged a cautious look, then turned toward her. Nathaniel spoke slowly. Anaris Elthir is an Eldari exodite world. Tiberius let out a sigh through his servo-breathing units. Anaris Elthir is an Iron Hands myth. Mentis's predecessor spent 2 centuries scouring the Arcana Inclusium for a supposed Eldari moon base and turned up nothing but rock. The names all over local data, forges, sailor yarns, even tavern songs. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. So the Iron Hands believe there's an Eldari base in the Reach. Tiberius waved his mechadendrites in exasperation. And you call Wirthan superstitious? If Anaris Elthir is real, the Eldari should be congratulated for hiding it so well. Not a single confirmed sighting. Perhaps if you spent more time dealing with the Drukhari, we'd have already located Elfsketha, which does exist and remains a far more pressing problem in the Reach. His tone sharpened slightly. Nathaniel unfolded his arms and twisted the ring on his augmetic wrist. Point taken, Magos. Tiberius nodded and handed the Sildathnidal back to Bornwolf. Keep it safe. Kelev raised his hands in protest. That's a relic. It should be claimed by Mars. Tiberius let out another sigh. Trust me when I say, in Bjornwolf's hands, it will make it to the Arch Magos, and she is the highest-ranking representative of Mars within 10 light-years. He lowered himself from his extended height with a hydraulic hiss. Now then, you still haven't told us the riddle of this infection. Shall we continue? The servitor completed cranking open the next section with a final mechanical clunk. Quite, said Kelev, voice oddly soft, and this Sildathnal device may yet prove my hypothesis. He shuffled forward, cryptic as ever. Bjornwolf tightened the leather strap over the pistol's ancient grip and hooked it securely to his belt. Then, wordlessly, he stepped ahead of the old man, taking point once more. Osric moved up beside him, lumen arrays flaring out ahead in their standard wedge pattern. The light revealed walls slick with condensed moisture, though the dripping had lessened. The far end of the corridor appeared mostly dry. This area had been recently reinforced. Fresh plasteel plating lined the walls, its edges sealed with foam by Hethrid's adepts. But the peace was marred by evidence of violence. Blast marks, plasma scoring, and impact craters told their own story. Weapons fire, noted Osric, tapping a scorched mark with his finger. The room itself was empty. Whatever furniture had once stood here had either been sucked out into the void or crushed into rusting piles under collapsed supports. A thin film of yellow sulfur clung to every surface. It was the first sign of deliberate defense they'd seen on the lower decks. Bjornwolf's mind began assembling the logic behind it. If the labs 3 floors above contained an artificial ocean, and if something had gone wrong down here, then collapsing or sealing access points could have been a desperate containment strategy. But it hadn't worked. As if sensing the thought, Kelev muttered behind him, "These lower levels were research labs. We are, quite literally, walking through what was once a Mechanicus engineering deck." At the far end of the hall, a row of hatchways branched outward. Some doors stood open, revealing strange shapes within. Several rooms had massive sulfur stalactites, indicating they once contained refrigeration units or containment fields, now long decayed. Where coolant had once boiled off, only yellow stone remains had been left, like sulfur statues clinging to the ceiling. The servitor approached the first sealed hatch. With a pneumatic hiss, the door slid upward, releasing a gust of stale, stinking air, kelp and sulfur, thick and cloying. A new chamber loomed beyond. They moved inside, weapons at low ready, eyes scanning. Braylon, bringing up the rear, paused. Her head turned slightly. That sound again, chains clinking. She wasn't sure if she heard it or remembered it. She glanced to Nathaniel, who had stopped. The apothecary's expression was sharp, tense. He'd heard it too. He said nothing. 2 servo skulls buzzed above them, and behind, a team of servitors were erecting a massive lumen arc lamp, its hum loud in the dark. Nathaniel shrugged, as if trying to dismiss it, though his posture said otherwise. He shook his head and followed. Braylon lingered just a second longer, eyes scanning the previous chamber. Then she stepped through the doorway, and the sulfur-smelling dark swallowed them all again. The room was intact. Bjornwolf stepped through the threshold, and for a moment it felt eerily familiar, like the private chambers of a runesmith back on NihtWyrtha. Dust choked the air. On one side, stacks of books filled sealed cabinets. Across the room were glass racks once holding reagents and compounds. Many bottles had shattered under pressure, their contents long evaporated or crystallized into mineral crusts. Bodies covered the room. Most were piled near a reinforced door, torn open from the other side. The metal was bent inwards like a can ripped by talons. Bjornwolf moved forward, checking the corpses as he passed, his sepenta raised instinctively. 3 bodies still slumped in suspension harnesses strapped into chairs at long-dead consoles. The systems had clearly locked them in place, holding them through the millennia. Among those on the floor, one drew his eye. The man, clearly a man before time mummified him, had a massive cavity in his chest, a jagged crater, not from any conventional weapon. In his curled, desiccated hand was another Sildathnidle. Bjornwolf stooped, pried the weapon free, and tossed it to Kelev, who caught it with a delighted "Ah!" and a reverent bow of thanks. Osric glanced up from the consoles. "Next one's mine," he said with a grin. "Looks like there was more than one Wolfgar," mused Tiberius, voice distant. "Most likely a standard pattern, not a unique piece," Osric observed, his tone pragmatic. The bodies by the torn door wore Wirthan cataphracti plate. Each bore plasma-based weapons, but they were damaged, beyond repair. Scorch marks, warped casings, and cracked power cells. Clearly they'd been used at close range. Several suits had been cut in half. Some bore deep gouges, others were split clean through. Armor was shredded, sundered. These warriors had made a stand. The door itself was torn and bent, gouged with talon marks, edges melted by plasma fire. Bjornwolf ran a hand over the ruined threshold. Whatever broke through, he thought grimly, paid dearly for it. "Over here," said Braylon, her voice hushed. They moved toward her. She knelt beside another corpse, face down, a plasma round still embedded in the small of his back. In one withered hand, he clutched a rough sack. Braylon carefully peeled back the dried fibers. Inside were fragments, small containers, preserved pages, notes. Something important. She didn't speak. Vane Kelev turned, already opening a nearby glass-steel-sealed cabinet. He removed a leather-bound book, but the pages began to flake and crumble in his hands. "Oh dear," he muttered. "No concern. We can hydrate these. They'll yield insight, no doubt, into what went on here." Tiberius had already taken another volume, but didn't dare open it. He looked at the faded cover. "Horticultural Techniques Under Unusual Suns, Volume 9, Shrubs and Vines," he read aloud in a flat tone. Kelev examined the cover of his own volume. Oh dear, bovine animal husbandry in half-gravity. The 2 men looked at one another with mechanicus neutrality. "Well," said Brother Nathaniel, arms crossed, "I suppose the Magos Biologica would be interested." "Yes," said Tiberius in a voice that was almost convincing, "it should greatly expand the knowledge of agri-worlds." He returned the book to the shelf, trying not to sound utterly disappointed. Braylon remained kneeling over the sack. Inside was a cracked flask, its contents reduced to crystalline residue, a delicate writing implement, still sharp, a bundle of scrolls bound in silk cloth. She didn't dare open most of them, but one had unraveled inside the bag, partially exposed to air. She gently teased it open. Her breath hitched. "Over here." Tiberius was the first to her side, taking the scroll with reverence. Despite its age and exposure, the ink had survived. The lumen lights shifted as the others gathered around. A figure was drawn, slender, inhuman, with elongated limbs and huge claws in place of hands. Annotations clustered around its anatomy, though they had faded into illegibility. At the top, written in trembling script, Neslip. Under the picture was the name NihtWyrtha. "Looks like Xenos," said Nathaniel, frowning. "Maybe something they encountered out here?" "Could be a daemon," offered Osric, narrowing his eyes. "Looks Slaneshi." "Can't be," said Kelev dismissively. "Slanesh wasn't born until the Cataclysm. That was just before the Great Crusade. This event took place nearly 15,000 years earlier." "Still could be a daemon," Osric muttered. "I'll grant you that." The old man conceded grimly. Bjornwolf made a face. A NihtWyrtha would translate as what? Nightbiter? Night-gnawer? A big vague. Braylon, still looking at the contents, said, "Could have many meanings. Night whisper or echo, maybe it was haunted their dreams, something from old Terra." She pulled a notebook from the sack, its material more like plastic than paper. She flipped through the pages. Dry, pliable, surprisingly intact. But much of the writing was faded or warped. "What's it say?" asked Nathaniel, peering over her shoulder. She squinted, her augmetic eye running through the color spectrum for better analysis. "They come in dreams. Must not let subjects dream. Dreams made real." She paused. "Mentions a bride. Yes, the bride again." Her hand slowed. "There's a sketch." Her breath caught again. The drawing was crude but clear. It matched the figure she had seen earlier on the station. "The bride," she whispered. "Yes, the bride," said Kelev, softly. They all turned to look at him, the lumen beams casting hard shadows across his face. "I forgot to mention the forgotten bride. There's mention of her in some of the compiled logs we salvaged from the upper levels." They continued staring. "She was a shuttle pilot," Kelev explained. "As far as we can piece together, most of the story comes from a journal left in the shuttle bay. The craft was found sealed, still intact inside. Apparently, she entered low orbit over the gas giant below. Her engines failed, couldn't regain altitude." He took a slow breath. "They sent a rescue, dropped chains to hoist her up. Something went wrong. Gravity shear, electrostatic disruption, we don't know. Her shuttle fell, straight into Thermende Gayat. Apparently she was due to be married, hence the name." There was silence. Kelev went on, quieter now. "After that, crew began seeing her around the station. Just fleeting glimpses. Moving shapes. The logbook mentions it several times. We thought it was just a ghost story." "Hooded cowl, long robes, Mechanica style but black, wet, and chains," said Braylon, voice low. Kelev nodded solemnly. Nathaniel drew his sidearm. "I've seen it too," he said. "It's demonic." The old man gave a helpless shrug. "We assumed it was a warp wraith, harmless, echoes of dead voidsmen lost to hyperspace mishaps, common enough in abandoned hulks." Tiberius's voice cut in, cool and disapproving. "Yes, but we should have been informed." Kelev sounded defensive. "Warp wraiths never hurt anyone. They're just fragments, static echoes of lost minds." Nathaniel shook his head. "Clearly not. These people didn't even have warp travel. Or if they did, it was primitive." A long pause. Kelev looked down, and for the first time in hours, said nothing. Braylon studied the identification tag on the corpse with a concentrated frown. It was fashioned from some kind of crystal or pressure-treated glass, cracked, faded, but legible. "The man's name was Dr. Badenoth," she read. "Apparently he was certified to operate a wagon up to level 2 and lived in Holmbjorg City." She glanced up. That would be the submerged ruins under the mountain, in the sea. "Doctor is an old Gothic term for apothecary," noted Nathaniel flatly. Bjornwolf picked a similar ID tag from one of the dead warriors. "Hlafopord Wereherd. He could operate a wagon up to level 4. Good for him. Says he lived in Moonview Towers, Skeduhelm." Tiberius chirped with excitement. "So there was a city there. At least one city on Skeduhelm before it was glassed." Bjornwolf gave him a long look. "Back then it must have been bustling. I wonder how many were evacuated at the end." The excitement faded from Tiberius's expression. "Apologies, I forgot. They were your people." Bjornwolf shrugged. "Never met the man. He didn't owe me money, so I'll let it pass." He studied the angle of the bodies, the placement, then looked across the room along a faint line of dried blood. "If I were to bet, and I'm a good gambler, I'd say Hlafopord Wereherd shot your apothecary in the back, then someone took him from behind." He nudged the body. The wound punched clean through the power pack, exiting the chest. "Why?" asked Nathaniel. Osric walked the scene, scanning the arcs of damage. "Looks that way," he agreed. Braylon hefted the sack of recovered scrolls. "We can only guess they were important. I'll make sure they get topside." She passed the bag to a waiting servitor and nodded for it to convey the relics up. Bjornwolf turned to the door. Long gouges, claws raked across its surface, possibly Nataetan. The corridor beyond was worse. Walls were torn by claw marks, the word Neslip scrawled again and again. With Osric beside him, they moved through each offshoot room. Most were abandoned. Tables, dust, a few bodies in civilian dress, others in white cataphracti armor, different from the blue-armored guards at the main lab. Bjornwolf had no idea what that meant. He turned a corner into a breached bulkhead. Dead soldiers were piled nearby, desiccated. He stepped through. "Why haven't we seen any bodies of what attacked them?" he whispered. Osric stepped closer. Daemons evaporate when slain. They entered an oval room, medical equipment, long-dead monitors, and the wreckage of complex machinery. Observation cells lined the walls. Glass teal shattered, beds with torn straps, most stained and open to vacuum. It looked more like a prison than a lab. Across one wall, scrawled in blood or chemical ink, "Don't sleep." Medication bottles littered the floor. "This looks like the epicenter," Bornwolf muttered. Osric spat toward spirits. Bornwolf moved past the others, deeper into the gloom. At the rear of the chamber, a corridor led downward. He took a few careful steps and froze. Beyond a ruined hatch lay a vast open space. A pit. His lumen beam swept down. Hundreds of bodies lay below, piled as if discarded. Skulls grinned upward. Each had a hole in the cranium. Osric and Nathaniel stepped beside him, their own lumens painting the horror below. "Thousands," Nathaniel said in a dry voice. "Exterminatus protocol. To stop them dreaming." Bjornwolf turned back to the central chamber, walking slowly on unsteady legs. "So we're looking at two separate entities," he said, "the Nitaetan and the bride." Kelev gestured to the sildatanidal holstered at Bjornwolf's hip. Its crystalline surface shimmered in the flickering light. "It explains a great deal," the old man said. His voice slipped into lecture mode, sharp and lucid. "The neurodisruptors used by the Officio Assassinorum are crude, designed for direct neural death. Hypothalamus, amygdala, perhaps the brainstem if you're being generous." He tapped the weapon. "This is different. It uses synaptic delay. At low charge, it doesn't kill, it interrupts. The target is left stranded in a loop, cut off from perception and reaction. It mimics dream paralysis. It doesn't silence the mind, it severs it from bearing." He let that sink in. "So Wolfgar went to Anaris Elther," Bjornwolf asked, "to get the sildathnidal? To stop the dreams?" Tiberius nodded. Wirthans show elevated psionic resonance compared to baseline humans. Nathaniel leaned over a medical table, resting both hands on its surface. Torn straps, the body once there, long gone. These were early psychers. They had never experienced their own powers. They didn't understand the warp. They were prey to what it contained. The shuttle pilot became a wraith. The Nitaetan were born of their dreams. The implants, the drugs, an attempt to prevent them from dreaming at all. "So the sildathnidal was used to stop the daemons breaching reality?" Bornwolf asked. "It would work. If the daemon was beginning a breach, it would separate the victim from the immaterium, saving them." He pointed to the corpse pit. "When that failed, they killed the dreamers." Bornwolf exhaled slowly. "So the colony was destroyed by a demonic incursion." Nathaniel shook his head. "Your people survived, but the other colonies didn't. Perhaps your ancestors culled the worst of their kind and buried the rest. Learned to suppress their powers, what's now called the Seer's Shadow." He looked up. "But daemons don't glass planets. They don't flood cities or summon oceans. Something else happened here." Tiberius nodded. "One more mystery solved, and two more born," he said in a resigned voice. "I did say it's better to show you than tell you," said the old techno-archaeologist with a chuckle. "Besides, I only suspected what was down here. I'm just glad I was of service." Bornwolf shook his head as thoughts drifted to his ancestors, those long-forgotten men who had sailed the void to found a colony 100 light-years from Terra's golden shore. He let out a breath through his nose, wearied by the weight of it all. Only to fall, he thought, as evolution cursed mankind with the psyker gene. He caught himself. Something felt off. His eyes scanned the room. There were 7 of them. He counted: a servitor, Magos Tiberius, 2 space marines, Braylon, Kelev, and himself. But someone else was standing there. 8. He turned his head slowly. A tall figure in black Mechanicus robes was slipping silently through a darkened doorway. Chains clinked as it vanished into shadow. Bjornwolf's hand twitched. He reached for his Serpenta, but paused. Instead, he drew the sildathnidal. It was glowing faintly, an ethereal blue. He glanced down. His seeks glowed as well, its Wirthan brass catching the same shimmer. "Must be the light," he told himself. He stepped toward the doorway, lifting his lumen, detached from his rifle, shining it into the gloom. The room was small, not too small. A personal office, judging by the fine woodwork. The door hung loose on its hinges. A body still sat slumped over the desk, face down in a pool of long-dried ink and blood. Shelves lined the wall, once holding bottles, now shattered. Stalactites had grown from the shelf rims. A picture, yellowed and stained, hung behind the desk. A man in a Navis Astra-style uniform surrounded by officers. On the other wall was a large painting of a space vista. One planet was lush and green with a span of waterways like great lakes. Huge cities were visible from orbit, a tall mountain range on the horizon. Beside it, another green world with many lakes, and orbiting that was a space station of glittering white with 7 rings. Many vast ships in orbit around it, with a smaller glowing orb far off, another moon of metal and plastic. Bjornwolf's eyes were drawn to the seated body's hip holster. Another of Wulfgar's weapons rested there, and in his right hand he still gripped a Serpenta pistol, barrel laid flat on the desk where the hot battle had scorched the wood. A miracle the body had stayed upright, perhaps frozen in place during venting. The desk was carved with serpent motifs, ancient and ornate. The parchment beneath the dead man's head was filled with scrawled, shaking script. One word repeated over and over, Neslip. An empty pill bottle lay on the floor. Bjornwolf saw the warrior ring still on the corpse's finger, and beside him she stood, the bride. Draped in black, her skeletal hand rested gently on the man's shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of mourning. She looked up. Her face was white as sun-bleached parchment, cracked and dry, as desiccated as the man beside her. Bjornwolf did not move. He felt no danger. He took a steadying breath. "You're meant to show me something, aren't you?" he said softly. She did not speak, but in his mind's eye visions bloomed. A cavern, deep beneath low halls, too short to be built by men. A lake, frozen in black. Beneath its ice, figures hung still, warped shapes. A long claw twitched. Something beneath began to wake. A wedding gown, blue silk, soaked in red wine, drifting in a slow, weightless swirl. Ravens, black and vast, leaving shattered void ships in their wake. They settled like living shadows on a larger wreck, bound in scaffolding, all under a ghost-pale sun. A warrior in blue, his pauldron marked with a skull and Astartes. He stood over the corpse of a Drukhari lord, clad in exquisite warplate. In the warrior's hand, a warrior ring, slipping onto his finger. He held a blade, black like ink suspended in water. It shimmered with living shadow. A world choked in green mist. Cities burned. A great firestorm raced across its surface. Vox channels screamed pleas for mercy, voices begging through static. Then a hand, cold, unmoved, cut the transmissions. A ocean not unlike Geofon Sea, an ironclad, ablaze, surged forward through its churning waves. The cliffs and shoreline were coated in pink moss, glowing slightly, dripping fluorescent slime. Red grass like glass shards danced in the wind. Above it all, the sky turned bright magenta. And in orbit, a maelstrom of ships, twisting and clashing, descending on the world. At their center, a tall woman, hoofed like a beast, crowned in curling horns. She laughed, the sound of shattering glass, as lesser daemons danced in her wake. Then, the visions faded, a voice unspoken. One path alters the other's fade. The bride was gone. Bjornwolf stood alone once more. The room was silent, save for the faint drip of condensation and the soft whir of servos in the walls. He had no idea what any of it meant. "Anything?" came Braelin's voice from behind. He exhaled and stepped back from the desk, revealing the corpse of the long-dead commander. Braelin grimaced. "There, Eorl?" she guessed. "Looks that way," said Osric, stepping in beside her. His lumen, brighter than hers, washed over the chamber, filling it with harsh white light. He glanced at the old wall painting, a faded solar chart, once lovingly etched. "Well, look at that. Nithelm had water for sure," he chuckled. "And your homeworld, Geofon, it covered less than half the planet back then." He frowned. "So, where did the water come from?" Bjornwolf said nothing. He moved behind the desk, careful not to disturb the brittle furniture, and reached down. With gloved care, he retrieved the third Silduthnidal disruptor, resting in the dead officer's holster. He turned it once in his hand, then tossed it underarm to Osric. The tech marine caught it without effort, his post-human reflexes precise as always. "You said you wanted the next one." Osric laughed, a genuine laugh, warm and rare. "Too true. My thanks," hloffered Bjornwolf. He gave a half-formal bow, the kind of gesture caught between humor and old respect. "But now I have a question." He looked between Bjornwolf and Braelin. "When we found this, or these, the weapons of Wulfgar, why didn't either of you even entertain the idea that the first body might be Wulfgar himself? He had the weapon, didn't he? It wouldn't be a stretch to say we found him. but neither of you even paused to consider it. Braylon tilted her head slightly. Statistically unlikely, she said evenly. And Wulfgar is mythic. The correlation of weapon to legend may be valid, but the conclusion lacked sufficient data at the time. Osric nodded, slowly, almost amused, then turned his gaze to Beornwulf. The Hlafop didn't speak immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on the surface of the desk, brushing aside a layer of dust with a single sweep of his finger. Beneath, the wood still gleamed faintly, preserved by vacuum, burnished by time, but it was only a facade. The structure beneath had warped, dried, calcified, like the man who sat at it, like the stories they all carried. It just didn't seem right, Beornwulf said at last. Wulfgar is remembered as both a warrior and a seer. That body, it didn't fit the legend. Osric gave a slow nod, then bowed again, cradling the ancient disruptor. Thank you again, he said simply, and turned to leave, taking most of the illumination with him. Braylon cast one last look around the shadowed chamber, shrugged slightly, and followed him. Beornwulf remained. His mind drifted, still replaying the visions. Had that been the past? Had he seen Wulfgar in battle, witnessed the drowning of NihtWyrtha, or had it been a warning? His lumen, now the only source of light, hovered over the corpse at the desk. Whoever this man had been, Eorl or not, he had died alone, perhaps in disgrace, but perhaps also in choice, to prevent worse from following. With a breath held longer than he realized, Beornwulf raised his hand across his chest and drew 2 fingers down the faceplate of his armor, an old gesture of silent honor. He gave a small nod to the long-dead man, then turned and left him in peace. Outside, the others were still speaking. Nathaniel stood with Osric, both studying the disruptor pistol. Tiberius noticed Beornwulf first. "Find anything?" the Magos asked. Beornwulf nodded. "A painting of the system before the fall." And, he paused, glancing back toward the door, an officer, long fallen. Tiberius's servo-skulls darted toward the chamber. The techno-archaeologist followed in their wake, murmuring reverent commentary as he vanished into the dark. Beornwulf stepped up beside the Magos. "You'd better inform Voratrix. She'll want to know." Tiberius gave a brisk nod. "The Archmagos is currently en route to retrieve an Astartes STC from Grimness." He arched an eyebrow. "You seem troubled. Afraid of ghosts?" Beornwulf frowned slightly. "My people still carry the Psyker gene. We've suppressed it for generations. But now, with the Imperium's arrival," Tiberius tapped a mechadendrite and thought, "Yes, best we keep that in mind." Nathaniel looked up from the disruptor. "It might not be a curse. If we're truly beginning a 10th founding, your world could offer powerful psychers." Tiberius gave this consideration. "Mentis should be notified. A proper librarius must be established, with training, controlled training." He swept his mechadendrites to gesture at the ruined corridor. "We've seen what happens when it goes unchecked." "I've already sent word," Nathaniel said. "Mentor Psychona Mentis is dispatching Ferrum Thaumaturgus, 2nd of the Librarius Order." Osric froze. He turned slowly toward the apothecary. "Mentis is sending Ferrum?" "Yes," Nathaniel said, blinking. "Is that a problem?" Osric holstered the disruptor, his usual mirth gone. He walked casually over to Beornwulf and placed a hand on his pauldron. "Tell me, Hlafopard," he said, "have you ever considered moving to Manifold Dawn? It's summer all year round. You'd love it." They walked on, Osric's voice echoing down the ancient corridor, fading into the station's long, hollow breath. Braylon gave Nathaniel a soft smile and fell into step beside Tiberius. Nathaniel lingered, enjoying the quiet. No hurry now. The techno-archaeologist ducked his head around the doorframe. He paused, about to call after them, then tilted his head. "What an odd fellow," he said, and turned back to sketch the faded painting with his servitor. Behind them, Heofonbrycg creaked and groaned, its 1,000-year breath echoing across the ruin. Somewhere deep within its bones, water dripped as the footsteps receded.